London, July 8, 1920. The Royal Air Force Ball at the Ritz Hotel. Prince Albert, Duke of York, 24 years old, the second son of George V, known within the family as Bertie, is watching a woman across the room. Later accounts converge on this as the moment his direction was set. He falls, by every subsequent record, completely and without reservation in love with her. Her name is Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She is 19, the fourth daughter and ninth child of Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorne. She has been formally presented at court this same summer season, which is how she ends up at the Ritz on this July evening. She is, by every contemporary description, warm and witty and socially at ease in a way that looks effortless, but almost certainly wasn't. Bertie does not apparently record it the same way. He invites himself to Glamis Castle, the Bowes-Lyon ancestral seat in Angus, Scotland, that September. He keeps writing. He keeps appearing. From the moment they meet in July 1920 until she gives him a definitive answer in January 1923, he pursues her with what Sally Bedell Smith's research, drawn from correspondence and diaries, describes as determination across 30 months and 3 separate proposals. 2 of those proposals she refused. Here is the version of this story that has circulated in authorized biography for decades. Elizabeth was reluctant because she genuinely didn't want royal life. She was a free-spirited aristocrat who valued her independence, and she spent nearly 3 years weighing that against genuine growing affection for Bertie, before finally deciding the man was worth the constraint. It's a love story about hesitation resolved by character. It's the version the authorized biographies endorse. Here is the version that appears in royal history comment sections, a version that has accumulated enough traction that it is worth examining carefully. She wasn't waiting for Bertie to win her over. She was waiting for his older brother. Edward, Prince of Wales, known within the family as David, was the heir to the throne, globally famous, and by every contemporary account, the more obviously eligible of the 2 men. The claim goes that Elizabeth preferred Edward, and only accepted Bertie once that option clearly wasn't happening. The first version is incomplete. The second is almost certainly wrong. Establishing the difference requires following the actual sources, which is less satisfying than a clean story and considerably more honest than either. Before following those sources, it's worth establishing who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon actually was in 1920, because the commoner swept off her feet by a prince framing obscures something more interesting. The commoner label is technically accurate. She had no royal blood, but contextually it's misleading. An earldom is the 3rd rank in the 5-rank British peerage. The Strathmore family had social connections that put them squarely in the court-adjacent world. Lady Mabel Earl, Countess of Earl, was a close family connection who served as Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Mary for decades, giving the Bowes-Lyons a direct line of proximity to the royal household. This wasn't a family navigating royalty from the outside. Elizabeth had grown up between Glamis Castle and St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire. Her brother Fergus was killed at the Battle of Luce in September 1915. Glamis was converted into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers throughout the war, which she helped manage. She had seen more of consequence by the age of 19 than many women twice her age. That isn't a shy personality. Crucially, she wasn't naive about what a royal marriage meant. She had watched Lady Earl's life of service close enough to understand the particular constraints of royal duty. She knew what she was being asked to agree to, and she knew what agreeing to it would cost. On February 27, 1921, Bertie invited himself to lunch at St. Paul's Waldenbury and proposed directly. The date is confirmed by Elizabeth's own letter, written the following day. Some popular accounts describe the proposal as occurring by proxy, but the February 28 letter establishes she received it in person and heard it from him. The letter reads, "I must write one line to say how dreadfully sorry I am about yesterday. It makes me miserable to think of it. Anyway, we can be good friends, can't we? Please do look on me as one. I shall never say anything about our talks, I promise you. And nobody need ever know. That isn't a woman who has been waiting for a better option. It's apologetic, not triumphant. It's warm, not dismissive. She wants to preserve the friendship. She is genuinely distressed about having said no. A follow-up letter on March 7th notes that his reply much relieved my mind, and that she felt just the same as you do about it. The stated reason for the refusal, drawn from her correspondence of this period, has followed the story ever since. She was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. That line comes from her own hand, written at the time, not recalled decades later. It's specific. It names a real fear about a real cost. Life as a royal duchess in 1921 meant an almost entirely public existence, correspondence potentially subject to review, personal preferences subordinated to institutional requirements. She had watched this dynamic close enough, through Lady Airlie's decades of royal service, to know it wasn't imagined. That is the documented reason for the first refusal, not another man. A clear-eyed calculation about what she was giving up. So where does the "she was waiting for Edward" theory actually come from? Most traceably, it begins with a single piece of journalism. In September 2009, when William Shawcross published his authorized biography of the Queen Mother, Guardian columnist Tanya Gold wrote a piece assessing Elizabeth's character. In it, she attributed to Hugo Vickers, the authorized biographer who preceded Shawcross, who published his own life of Elizabeth in 2005, the claim that she had wanted to attract the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, but he brushed her off and she married his younger brother George instead. That sentence has been reproduced across royal history discussions ever since. It's treated as a settled biographical finding. It isn't. For a start, it's a journalistic paraphrase of an interpretation, not a direct quotation from Vickers's book, and not supported by a primary letter from Elizabeth herself. No scholarly review or summary of the 2005 Vickers biography has produced a passage in which he quotes contemporaneous correspondence showing Elizabeth expressing romantic interest in Edward during 1920 or 1921. The sentence captures what Gold understood Vickers to be suggesting. It isn't what Vickers documented Elizabeth as having written. What Vickers does appear to have noted separately is that Elizabeth retained a soft spot for the Duke of Windsor, which sounds, stripped of context, like confirmation of the theory. The context matters, however. This framing appears in a 2016 letter by the historian Alistair Lexton, and it refers to Elizabeth's feelings about Edward as her brother-in-law, feelings that developed across decades of complex familial history after the abdication, after the war, after 30 years of proximity. Ambivalent warmth toward someone you have known as family for 3 decades isn't primary evidence of a pre-marriage romantic preference in 1921. More directly, that same Lexton letter cites Elizabeth's own diary from January 1923, the month she finally accepted Bertie's proposal. When a press story began circulating that the Prince of Wales was linked romantically to a Scottish lord's daughter, Elizabeth wrote in her diary that the suggestion was too stupid and unfounded. Her own hand. The same month, she accepted Bertie. Dismissing the exact story that would eventually become the "waited for Edward" theory. The major biographies are consistent on this absence. William Shawcross had virtually unrestricted access to Elizabeth's personal papers, letters, diaries, and the royal archives, plus taped interviews she gave in the 1990s. His 1,000-page authorized biography covers the courtship extensively. No reviewer of that biography, no scholarly summary of its contents, records Shawcross producing Royal Archives correspondence in which Elizabeth expresses romantic desire for Edward during 1920 to 1922. John Wheeler Bennett's 1958 authorized biography of George VI, the earliest major account, drawn from royal diaries and correspondence, also does not attribute the refusals to an Edward preference. Lady Airlie's 1962 memoir, Thatched with Gold, is sometimes cited as though it might contain relevant testimony. The accessible passages concern wartime rationing, estate management at courtship, and a childhood portrait of young Bertie's stammer and sensitivity. The scholarly consensus is explicit. Historian Andrew Roberts has stated, "No reputable historian believes the Queen Mother was ever in love with Edward VIII, let alone tried to marry him." Historian John Julius Norwich called the idea perfectly crazy, with nothing between them like that. Gareth Russell, who specifically examined Edward's timetable for the period, found that Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales were recorded as being in the same room 3 times before her acceptance of Bertie in January 1923. 3 occasions over 3 years, during a period when Edward was out of the country for months on royal tours. Australia in 1920, India in November 1921, Japan in 1922. Russell described the "Wanted Edward" story as just a cruel rumor that somebody made up. What were those 3 occasions? There is a documented instance in May 1921, when Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales were guests at the same social event, per Sally Bedell Smith's research. Princess Mary's wedding at Westminster Abbey on February 28, 1922, placed them in the same room. Elizabeth was a bridesmaid, Edward his sister's brother. One account from the Lady magazine places all 3, Elizabeth, Bertie, and the Prince of Wales, at a Christmas 1922 ball hosted by Mrs. Ronnie Greville. 3 occasions across 3 years. Russell also identified a possible origin for the "Waiting for Edward" story. Edward VIII himself reportedly claimed, years after the events, that Elizabeth had been in love with him. This claim emerged during a period when his relationship with his sister-in-law was strained. Elizabeth held him responsible for what she regarded as an irresponsible abdication that shortened her husband's life. A self-serving claim made when 2 people are on bad terms isn't the same as documented history. The more credibly documented complexity in the official love story isn't Edward at all. It's a Scottish equerry named James Stuart. Stuart served as Prince Albert's equerry during this period. Sally Bedell Smith's biographical research, drawn from correspondence and diaries, describes Elizabeth as besotted with Stuart in 1920 and 1921. Multiple secondary accounts corroborate him as a genuine romantic interest in her life during the years she was refusing Bertie. He subsequently departed for the American oil industry, taking a position in Oklahoma. Whether Queen Mary arranged the job opportunity to remove Stuart from the picture, this circulates in popular retellings as an almost irresistible plot, lacks primary documentation. The record confirms only that Stuart left. What that detail establishes is that Elizabeth's most credibly documented competing romantic interest during the refusal years wasn't the heir to the throne. It was a young Scottish equerry who went to work in the oil business. That is a more human story than strategic positioning for the crown, and it's better supported by the available evidence. There is also a structural problem with the "Waiting for Edward" reading that the timeline itself makes plain. Edward's relationship with Freda Dudley Ward had been ongoing since spring 1918. She was born Winifred May Birkin and married in 1913 to William Dudley Ward, a Liberal MP with whom she had 2 daughters. The relationship began, reportedly, at a party in Belgrave Square during a First World War air raid. By the time Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was formally presented at court in July 1920, Edward had been writing to Freda 2 or 3 times daily for 2 full years. The depth of that attachment wasn't a private matter in the circles Elizabeth moved in. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and Freda Dudley Ward was, as multiple sources confirm, common knowledge in aristocratic circles. Winston Churchill, who observed the pair together in 1927, wrote, "It's quite pathetic to see the prince and Freda. His love is so obvious and undisguisable." Letters from 1921, published in the volume Letters from a Prince, edited by Rupert Godfrey from a trunk of correspondence discovered by chance in Canada, show Edward writing to Freda, "Christ, life is bloody sans toi, just not worth living." He was writing her daily. He was describing his life as not worth living in her absence. Frances Donaldson, whose 1974 biography of Edward VIII won the Wolfson Prize for History, characterized the Frida relationship as having stopped him from marrying, treating it as the foundational pattern of his emotional life, the model for his subsequent dependence on women who were already committed elsewhere. Philip Ziegler's authorized biography of Edward VIII drew on the prince's diaries and more than 2,000 letters to Frida. His portrait is of a man who engaged in a succession of intense affairs with married women: Frida from 1918, Thelma Furness from around 1929, Wallis Simpson from the early 1930s, never resolving his romantic situation toward anything that would have made him a realistic dynastic prospect. George V himself told a courtier, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." The king's assessment of his heir's suitability for marriage predates the abdication crisis by more than a decade. For the "waiting for Edward" theory to hold, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was socially astute, who moved in circles where Frida Dudley Ward's role in Edward's life was common knowledge, who had observed the royal family closely enough to understand what it meant that George V had essentially written off his eldest son's dynastic future, would have to have been waiting for a man who was writing daily love letters to someone else. The theory requires her to have been either uninformed or irrational. The documentary record of her character suggests she was neither. Prince Albert's second proposal came in the early months of 1922. The most specific dating, from Sally Bedell Smith's research, places it on March 7, 1922, shortly after Princess Mary's wedding at Westminster Abbey on February 28, where Elizabeth served as one of 8 bridesmaids. Edward was present that day as Mary's brother. She had served alongside 2 of her future brothers-in-law, as a contemporary photograph confirms. What followed was Bertie proposing again. She said no again. The reasons appear unchanged from 1921. Her correspondence with Bertie from March 1922 is warm. She writes to him in a tone that clearly values the friendship and is sorry to continue refusing him. But the refusal is consistent. The fear about royal life had not resolved itself. Bertie continued to visit Glamis and correspond through 1922. Queen Mary, having formed a strongly favorable impression of Elizabeth during her own Glamis visit in autumn 1921, reportedly concluding that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy, refrained from direct interference, but was clearly invested in the outcome. What changed between spring 1922 and January 1923 isn't definitively established by what survives in the record. Growing affection through sustained contact is the most plausible explanation the biographies offer. Near the end of 1922, an external catalyst appears to have been added. A press story began circulating that the Prince of Wales was linked romantically to an unnamed Scottish lord's daughter. The speculation alarmed Elizabeth, who noted in her January 1923 diary that the rumor was too stupid and unfounded. Whether the alarm was primarily about being misidentified as a romantic interest of Edward's, while Bertie's question was still open, or about something else entirely, isn't clear from what survives. One account in the Lady magazine describes the rumor as having contributed to Bertie's third approach shortly after. Prince Albert's third proposal came on January 2nd or 3rd, 1923. Sources differ by a day. At Claridge's Hotel in London, over dinner and dancing. He asked again. She still didn't say yes immediately. Elizabeth started a diary at the beginning of 1923, apparently charting her doubts over the following 2 weeks. This isn't the behavior of a woman who has been waiting for this moment and is now finally allowing herself to have what she wanted. It's the pattern of someone who knows exactly what the yes commits her to and is making herself ready to commit. She accepted close to midnight on Sunday, January 14, 1923. The engagement was announced in the court circular the following morning. The New York Times carried the announcement that same January 15th. Bertie wrote to Queen Mary that he was the happiest man in the world. The documentary record of Elizabeth's state of mind is more layered. Terrified, a 2-week deliberation, a diary specifically begun to chart her doubts. Genuine affection for Bertie, accumulated through 30 months of sustained contact, appears real. The apologetic warmth of her letters, the consistency with which she framed her refusals as regret rather than rejection, suggests she genuinely liked him. But liking someone and choosing a life defined by public duty are different things, and the evidence is that she was making a choice she understood fully when she made it. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. The wedding rings were crafted from Welsh gold from the Clogau St. David's mine in Bontu, beginning a royal tradition that persists. Elizabeth laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior on her way into the abbey, in memory of her brother Fergus, a gesture that every royal bride has echoed since. The narrative that emerged from that wedding and calcified over the following decades was built through authorized biography. John Wheeler Bennett published the first major life of George VI in 1958, 6 years after the king's death, appointed as official biographer with access to royal diaries, correspondence, and interviews. His account of the courtship, 3 proposals, Elizabeth's genuine reluctance about royal duty, eventual acceptance built on growing affection, became the foundational framework. He didn't attribute the refusals to an Edward preference. He framed the story as reluctance won over by persistence and character. William Shawcross was commissioned by the royal family after Elizabeth's death in 2002 and published the authorized Queen Mother biography in 2009 with what he described as virtually unrestricted access to her personal papers, letters, diaries, and the royal archives, plus taped interviews she gave in the 1990s. The book approaches 1,000 pages. The Guardian's Catherine Bennett, reviewing it, called it indulgent, overlong, and ultimately unsatisfying, while acknowledging that Shawcross's exclusive archive access proves his undoubted authority. The structural feature of authorized biography is that access and selection are both controlled by the same party. The Royal Archives have no public inventory and are largely exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. Independent scholars can't audit what materials exist and weren't included. What Shawcross published is visible. What he had access to and chose not to include isn't. Elizabeth herself exercised significant control over her personal papers throughout her lifetime, deciding which letters and documents were preserved and which weren't. She lived to 101. She died in March 2002. She had 8 decades after her 1923 wedding in which to shape the archival record. The letters that survived into the published collection, including the February 28, 1921 letter to Bertie, which reads with such genuine apologetic warmth, are letters she kept. Their survival is itself a form of archival curation. The James Pope Hennessy parallel is instructive. Pope Hennessy wrote the authorized biography of Queen Mary with extraordinary palace access and produced what was considered a masterwork in its published form. His private notes, accessed by scholars after his death, showed a considerably more candid portrait than the published text. The distance between what authorized biographers observe privately and what they publish isn't unique to one book or one family. It's structural to the genre. The incentives run in one direction. For Elizabeth, the incentives after 1936 were particularly clear. When the abdication crisis put an unprepared George VI on a throne he hadn't sought, the stability of the monarchy depended significantly on Elizabeth's ability to project steadiness and purpose. She stood in bombed-out East End streets during the Blitz. She refused to leave London. She became a national symbol precisely because the story of how she got to that position could be made to look simple and inevitable. The reluctant romantic narrative isn't fabricated. The contemporaneous letters confirm real hesitation. 3 proposals over 30 months is confirmed. The afraid never to be free phrasing is authenticated and contemporaneous. What the official account smoothed away isn't a lie. It's a selection. What it leaves out, the social world Elizabeth was navigating, which included James Stewart as a documentably real competing romantic interest. the full weight of family and social pressure across 30 months, the 2-week deliberation that followed even the third proposal, the terrified she used to describe herself to a close friend in the same month she accepted. And it omits the structural argument, not that Elizabeth calculated coldly, but that she was a woman in a specific historical moment, navigating a constrained set of options with intelligence and agency. And that the version of the story that presents this as simply love overcoming shyness is shaped by the people who had every reason to want it presented that way. What the version that circulates in comments gets wrong is simpler. Elizabeth didn't want Edward. The evidence for that claim doesn't exist in primary sources. Multiple professional historians have rejected it explicitly. It's probably traceable to Edward himself making a self-flattering claim during a period when he and his sister-in-law were on poor terms. The wanted Edward theory is almost certainly wrong, and repeating it as the suppressed truth is less accurate than the authorized version it claims to correct. The version that actually persists, reluctant commoner, patient prince, love conquers doubt, isn't false so much as incomplete. It's the version the family needed, told, shaped by authorized biographies with structural incentives to simplify, and polished across decades into something smoother and more reassuring than what 2 refused proposals and 1 accepted third actually suggest. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became one of the most consequential figures in 20th century British monarchy. She died at 101 in March 2002, having outlasted virtually everyone who might have said otherwise. 3 years, 2 refusals, 1 answer she didn't give for 2 weeks after she finally said yes, and a decision that she spent the rest of her very long life making sure nobody examined too carefully again.